Chris. It's chartered by the public entity that owns it or at least governs it. So that sounds a little bit complicated, but it should become clearer as we get into the discussion a little bit. Now, I apologize, my printer broke down just as I was printing out my notes for this. So I'm going to be looking at those while I speak. So there's various kinds of public banks, land banks, which I won't go into describing, but obviously what they seem like they're real estate oriented and again for public purposes. There are uh, infrastructure banks. There's an effort right now to create an infrastructure bank of the United States that would fund the kind of infrastructure projects that Congress has repeatedly failed to fund in the previous infrastructure bills. And I'm talking about physical infrastructure. I'm not saying that the previous bills haven't been very useful. They've done a lot of good things, but we really need to deal with the physical infrastructure. So that's another kind of public bank that we could have and we may end up having. And there's also state and municipal public banks, and those are going to be what we're discussing tonight. So there's other ways to divide up types of public banks too. For instance, retail versus meaning individual people can deposit to the bank. But the kind of banks that we're going to be talking about are banks whose funds come from the state or municipalities, and in particular the state. We're going to focus on state banks because that's what Oregon Public Banking Alliance is working on. We're working for a state bank in Oregon. So let me just give you a little bit of history of our, well, the effort to create state banks in Oregon. This is not the first time, and we are not the first entity that's worked on it. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that there was an effort to create a state bank. I believe it was in 2009, but don't quote me on that. That didn't go anywhere because the people putting it together were told they got a legal opinion from the Legislative Council's office who said that state banks aren't allowed under our Constitution. Well, we beg to differ. One of our chief people in the Central Working Group is a professor of banking law at Willamette University, and he put a whole team of about 30 students on this, and they did a very detailed review of the law in Oregon and nationally, and it appears that there was already a decision that said that they were legal in Oregon that looked at our Constitution. So from that point of view, it's already been decided, but you know, um, uh, courts can always reverse previous courts. So I guess technically it hasn't been, but the argument is pretty unassailable. And it's an argument that's been around for a while, but never argued in a case where someone was actually trying to establish a public bank. So anyway, it started in 2009. We revived this in a different form a couple of years ago and worked on getting a structure for municipal banks, legislation that would make it clear how to form municipal banks, like a Portland Bank or a regional bank in Lynn and Benton County, for instance, or a city bank somewhere else, a Corvallis City Bank. At any rate, that didn't work out. Probably started too late, probably didn't have enough legislative allies, but things are different now. We actually got a bill passed in the last session that would have established a task force to work out the details of how a state bank would work, how it would be funded, how it would be governed. And the governor didn't sign that for probably various reasons. And at any rate, we did make some changes and we're planning on introducing that in the short session. When I say we, I'm talking about, of course, our legislative allies, but we're working closely with them and helping them craft the legislation. So anyway, who are these guys, the Oregon Public Banking Alliance? I mean, what the heck is a retired psychiatrist doing talking to you about public banking? The fact is I'm the least professionally qualified to be talking about this, but I've been interested in state banks for quite some time because of their potential. I've done a lot of reading about it, and I think I'm qualified to at least give you the gist of what we're doing and the benefits of a state bank and everything you need to know, because I'm going to leave lots of time for questions. So anyway, I mentioned that we have a professor of banking law who's a major member. We have two members of the Public Banking Institute based in San Francisco, which is a national advocacy organization working on state banks across the country. They serve an advisory capacity and they do research and provide resources. And we have the support of a number of different groups around the state who you can find out who they are on our website. That's Oregon Public Banking.org, not excuse me, .com, not org, in case you were expecting it to be. I don't know why that happened. At any rate, so now you want to know probably, how do these public banks work? Okay, they're going to do all this great good, but I don't really understand this. You know, if they don't take individual investors, don't have to take individual investors, how does this work? Well, they take, in this case, in a state bank, they would take the available funds from the state that we normally park in Wall Street banks. And we make a nominal interest on that, like you and I make on our banking, our savings accounts, but not much. And they actually pay a lot more in fees probably than they get back, as you and I do. But if they use their own money, they create their own bank, they put it in there to capitalize it and provide operating capital, and boom, you've got a bank. Now, how do banks work? Do people know how banks work? Basically, they take their available capital and they loan out the funds 10 to 1. So if they've got $1,000 available loan, they can loan out 10,000. The idea being that people aren't going to want all their money back at once, and that is true in even the private sector. In the public sector, you may say, well, what if they do want it all at once? In the private sector, they go to the FDIC if there's a run on the bank, and they can pay off those loans temporarily. So nobody's really at risk. In the case of a state bank, it's a little bit different. Let's remember again whose funds these are. It's the state bank. And why can't a state bank have it's the state's funds. So why can't a state bank have a run? Because they're not ever gonna want all their money back at once. Um, it just wouldn't happen. If it did, we could go bankrupt without a state bank. Thank you very much. Because really the only money at risk is that available funds. So anyway, what do they use these funds for again? I mentioned loans. Um, they they make loans within the state and specifically to further specified goals. So when the bank is chartered by the state, they say what the purposes of the bank is, basically what kind of loans they can make. And these loans are made in cooperation with credit unions and local banks. In other words, we can actually loan a lot more than 10 to 1 if we partner with credit unions and local banks, because we'll be using their funds too. What that means is that the credit unions and the local banks, they can make much larger loans, they can make more loans, and they can make loans to things that we think are important that maybe they couldn't afford to make before. So I keep saying, this is for public benefit. Can I be more specific about what that means? Let me just give some examples of the kind of loans, and it's not just loans. They can also finance bonds, which is very important if you look at the economics of it. So here's some of the kinds of loans they can make. They can make loans to small farmers. If they wanted to make sure that minority-owned businesses had adequate access to credit, they could specifically have a program to loan to minority-owned businesses. They can fund bonds for affordable housing, for green energy projects, climate resilience, energy conservation projects like retrofitting. Um, and then they can make student loans is another one. They do that in North Dakota, where they have the only state bank in existence in this country. So, and then again, I said state and local infrastructure projects, and I'll get back to that because that's particularly important. But the main thing is they not only can make these funds available, but they can operate at favorable rates, because these are not brick and mortar buildings. We use the existing credit unions and small banks, local banks, to actually do the physical process of making these loans. Um, and these loans consequently have to meet the standards of the banking profession. These are not risky loans just because we're targeting certain things that the state wants to promote. These are not pie in the sky. The state isn't just putting the money out there. The idea is to actually bring back more money in the interest they do charge than it costs to operate the bank. And we know it's possible because, as I already said, uh, the Bank of North Dakota has been doing it for over a century. The Bank of North Dakota, let's talk about that for a little bit. It's the only state bank in the country again. It was founded in 1919. It was conceived by the Nonpartisan League, which existed back then in North Dakota. Um, and it was nonpartisan, but the legislature, if I recall correctly, was Republican dominated, but it wasn't a partisan issue then, and it shouldn't be now. And it's still the state bank in North Dakota is very popular with members of both parties because they've seen the benefits for themselves. So it was set up primarily to help farmers uh, who couldn't get loans at a rate they could afford from the big banks, and also to avoid the state being dependent on national banks. Um, we can talk about why that's a major problem. I mean, there are municipalities who've been driven to bankruptcy, and a big part of their financial problems were trying to repay um, loans at interest rates they couldn't afford. At any rate, the Bank of North Dakota has made a profit every year since it was created in 1919. And 2022 was a record year. So their profits have been increasing, and they've been accumulating more capital from the profits for over 100 years. Imagine what they can do. Uh, they actually help their citizens weather the depression. They paid teacher salaries at full rate instead of a discounted rate that other banking institutions were willing to lend the money to the state at. And they made a profit in 2008 when the big banks were failing. So if you have any questions about the safety of these banks, let that be a lesson to you. And we can explore that in more depth too if people have questions during the question and answer period. So let's just talk a little bit before I do go to Q&A about the advantages of public banks. So I mentioned that they offer favorable rates, and I think I made the point that was mostly due to efficiencies. They have very low overhead. They're not paying a lot of money for salaries to Wall Street executives. And more importantly, they're not diverting any profits to stockholders. Now, it's possible that a bank could be financed privately, but if they sold stock, it would not be voting stock. These people would not have anything to do with the way the bank is operated. They would simply be making a safe investment and get a rate of return a little bit over the rate that T-bills are offering. T-bills also being very conservative. There are other ways to finance it too, given that interest rates are going up. Um, for instance, unions might want to park, they need to park their money in a safe place too, or a certain proportion of it. They could potentially be a source. Or the state could look at it as an investment and they could put some money into it. At any rate, they're efficient. They don't pay out profits except perhaps a fixed profit to private investors if that's how they decide to capitalize it. So anyway, I mentioned I was going to come back to infrastructure loans and tell you why they're so important. If you've ever looked at the costs of a 30-year loan, even at the interest rates of a few years ago, before we hit this the bump in inflation, they could double the cost of a 30-year loan. And 40 to 50% is not at all unusual. The cost of a financing a bond. And so I can't give specific numbers. It depends on the details. But obviously, with those efficiencies, a public bank could offer them at cheaper rates. And again, the Bank in North Dakota does. Now, the banking industry, when we were trying to, when they were taking public comments on the bill that we got passed, tried to say that we had no need for this because there are revolving funds available for loans. These aren't revolving funds. Remember, we can leverage 10 to 1. We keep the money in state. And that means it's going to generate tax revenues through creating jobs through a lot of these loans, or building businesses, making them more profitable for the small businesses and farmers. And in addition to increasing tax revenue, the state can also receive dividends, as they do in North Dakota. And of course, as I mentioned, North Dakota had record profits in 2022, and they returned a record dividend to the state. And again, I think it's easy to see why these banks are safer than the Wall Street banks. If you understand the problems that the Wall Street banks have had and why they failed, they do not follow prudent banking practices, and so they take a lot of chances in order to maximize profits, and that is not the purpose of a state bank. If you're interested in that topic, I don't want to get into too much detail unless people have questions about it, but the current banking system, national banking system, is much more unstable than most people realize. And if you want to talk about it, I'll talk more, but I really want to get to questions, especially since we started late. So I'll throw it open here. If you know how to use well, if you don't know how to raise your hand, you go to, let's see, do we have reactions on this one? Go to more, the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen on the right, click reactions, and there's a raise hand bar. This is the easiest way to keep it organized. So I assume people have questions. There's a lot more to this than I talked about. Linda, you're muted. You're still muted.
We've got some questions in the chat. The first one is the state bank a benefit company or B Corp?
Well, that's a really good question, because we don't have a state bank. Now, if you're talking about the bank in North Dakota, I don't think they even had B Corps back then. But there's different ways to do it, and I don't want to get into the technicalities because I'm not a lawyer. But you can do it as a B Corp. You can do it as a state public interest corporation. I believe they have a special type of corporation that they can form. But again, I'm not the expert. However, the main point here is that we don't have them yet. And that brings us back to an important point that I really didn't emphasize. we are trying to establish, first off, a task force to look at all these possibilities and decide the advantages and disadvantages of each possibility so that we can come up with the best type of bank that would suit our needs. Good question.
The other is a comment which I will read, and maybe Mike Beilstein, you would like to follow that up with more. He says, cost of municipal bonds is double the value of the loan because of interest, which goes to big Wall Street banks. A state bank could loan to municipalities at can't see the whole word, competitive near zero rates and save money for municipal borrowers. Any profit would stay with the state.
Yeah, that's essentially true. I'd make a few clarifications though. The practicalities of it are that they wouldn't be near zero because remember we're partnering with banks that do need to make a profit. And so, but they are definitely competitive because they're still way more efficient. So Mike is absolutely right about that. They obviously do save money for municipal borrows. We talked about that, and the profits stay within the state. Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or did you disagree?
I realized as I was writing that, I was concerned that you weren't really talking about that sort of benefit, the benefit to local governments of having a state bank.
Mhm.
And as I was writing it, you ended up saying exactly what I was writing as I was writing it. So it wasn't,
Okay.
the comment wasn't really necessary. But I
Well,
think that you should emphasize that this is but there's really a great loss of wealth to the state by municipal bonds that are financed outside of the state, and all the interest, which turns into profit, goes outside the state, while a state bank would keep, even if the state bank is making a profit off of these municipal bonds, at least that money would stay in the state. It wouldn't be leaving our local economy. So
right. And the profit is a lot less. I mean, we do want the bank to grow. Like I said, the Bank of North Dakota grew over 100 years, and it can do a lot more now than it used to be able to. The reality is, at first, unless we want to make a huge investment in the bank, we're going to only be able to make limited kinds of loans. The biggest infrastructure projects, for instance, we could probably, we may not be able to meet every need that way. So we do need to grow, especially since the point is to grow the economy of Oregon by keeping the money local and not paying it out to the big banks, like Mike said. Thank you for emphasizing that, Mike.
yeah, thank you.
You bet. And I
We
see,
have another,
go ahead.
okay, we have another question. What level of capitalization is being contemplated for the Oregon State Bank?
Boy, you guys are just jumping right into the details. Again, I have to say that is a question that's going to be for the task force. I can tell you that our banking experts have kind of played around a little bit with the numbers, but they haven't talked in our meetings about detailed. But that's a really good question because for the reason I just said, the more you capitalize a bank for, the more you can make loans in the long run, the more loans you can make and bonds you can finance.
At this point, I don't think anybody needs to write questions in the chat. You could just go ahead and unmute and ask Rick your question. Oh, there's one more I'll read before we take more. Is the benefit primarily for municipalities? Seems credit unions fill the local need.
Well, that's a really good point too. Municipalities would benefit the most for sure. But again, these are lower interest loans. So if you're targeting them for, say, loans to farmers or loans to small businesses, they would save money and be able to have more profitable businesses, more growth, hire more people. That's the idea. of how it benefits the economy. So it isn't just municipalities. Also, if we're able to make student loans, which I don't believe most credit unions do. In fact, don't think any credit unions do that, or local banks. If we're able to give them that capacity, and they can make low interest student loans that would be, highly competitive with national banks, which is what North Dakota does, there's an obvious benefit there too. So no, it's not just municipalities. And no, the credit unions don't fill all of the local need. They make some of those loans, of course, but they can't afford to do it as cheaply as they could do if it was financed through a state bank either. Alex?
Oh, hey, thanks, Rick. Sorry, I was in and out. I wasn't able to catch the whole presentation, but I was going to ask you. It seems to me that there was a bill that allocated some money for a study to establish a state bank, and that Governor Kotek vetoed. I think Governor Kotek vetoed that, and it was a pretty minor amount of money. So I'm just wondering, is my recollection correct? And if so, what's the task? What's the alliance? How are they addressing the pushback from the governor?
Well, first of all, I need to say that the governor did say she supported the concept, and I should have been more specific about her objections. I don't want to make it look like she's a bad guy. What she said was that the timetable that the legislation called for, which was 1 year, was not sufficient. It would overload the agency that it was assigned to, which maybe wasn't the ideal agency to assign it to, but for practical reasons, that's why our champions assigned it to that agency. They had 80 other agencies to oversee. Now, it's debatable whether a task force really would have been too much for an agency that large to take on top of their other responsibilities, especially since the timetable could very easily have been extended. They did that for the Universal Healthcare Task Force just 2 years before. So I really don't understand her argument, but I don't want to impugn her motives, certainly. And she does say she's a supporter. So we've taken the opportunity to make some adjustments to the bill that might make it a better sell. And we've got more time now to get more legislative allies. I mean, we had a ton of support in the legislature for the original legislation, but there wasn't a lot of time. We didn't network as well as we could have with more conservative legislators. So that's one thing. If I have any ask for the people here who might want to support this effort, if you're in a district with more conservative legislatures, please talk to them about the advantages of this, because somehow the word just didn't get out. We were, I think, exclusively got Democratic support, but obviously overwhelming Democratic support since it passed.
So thanks, Rick. Sorry, just quick follow-up. So do you have a champion, or do you have a sponsor for the short session, or is this going to be kind of put off for the next full regular session?
We intend to reintroduce it in the interim session, and exactly who we're going to ask to take the lead is an inside baseball question. So going to leave it that way.
All right. Thanks, Rick. Appreciate it.
Sure. Lucy?
Yes, I'm especially interested in having it defined as a green bank, given climate change. I think just having it defined that way would encourage people to get loans to make the conversions that would help, like from gas to electric appliances in their homes, or putting up solar panels, or farmers converting to regenerative agriculture. It's time for that. It's essential, and any publicity in that direction would be wonderful.
Sure. Well, that's one of the things the legislature could identify as a need for making loans. They could prioritize that. And they probably have to establish their own programs. Now, one of the things I didn't mention that a state bank can do is they could be a pass-through for federal programs. They could get grants like the federal program for uh, oh, I'm blanking, the IRA bill.
Yeah,
It, there were a lot of grants involved in that, and they had to go to, either ad hoc agencies or whatever, and that's just way more complicated. If you've got an agency already in place that does that, whose job is to take state funds, that grant goes straight there, and they start looking at loan proposals. So that would be an advantage. The question about whether or not it should be called the green bank is again one of those political questions that people have to argue. Is that going to help it get passed, or is it going to hurt it? Because we really do want bipartisan support. The last thing we want is for people to think this is a partisan issue. It is
And-
absolutely not. This is for all Oregon and all Oregonians.
and can it go to loans for individuals or is it to organizations?
Well, I doubt it, but again, that's a legal question that I don't even think we've talked about, because we're mostly thinking in terms of the advantages to businesses. They could be individually owned businesses, and to municipalities and the state itself.
Thank you.
Sure. Antonio?
Thank you, Rick. And all of you who work on this, public banking is super exciting to me. I have a question for you in the form of an analogy. Are you worried at all that by not including a retail banking option from the start, you are in effect doing what the Obama administration did when they took single payer off of the table in the very early days of what would become Obamacare? And by retail banking, I mean retail commercial banking, like savings checking accounts for individuals, human beings, that would be insured, if not through the FDIC, through some new Oregon-based mechanism, up to some index value. For example, 2 times the median savings or checking account balance. Because frankly, very few of us normal human beings have or need $200,000 insurance in our checking or savings account, right?
Mhm.
Raise your hand if you have $250,000 on your savings account right now, folks. Maybe build us. Thank you.
Sure. Well, you make some good points there. And to get to your question, there are certainly advantages to being able to be a retail bank. People can relate to that. They can say, oh yeah, bank's where I put my money and it uses it to make loans when I need loans. And so they can relate to that. That's one advantage. Another advantage is, yeah, they'd like to get in and get the lower interest loans too, right? Part of it has to do with capacity though. We haven't done an analysis of exactly, first of all, the exact need in the state for small business loans and municipal loans and all that. We do have plenty of evidence that there's not enough available and that some people who'd like to get them can't afford them at current rates. I mean, we know that. So one of the things we want to do early on is to get an analysis like that. And they've done it in other states. And, there's nothing unique about Oregon, frankly, as far as that goes. We have revolving funds available. They're limited in amount. They're still higher interest than a public bank could offer. So it's not comparable. When people say that all our needs are met, I beg to disagree. I think some people are not taking loans who could. Some people can't get the loans when they want to. Wall Street banks don't want to make loans unless there's enough profit in it to be worth their time. They're like, they have a higher profit. They expect a higher profit margin than mom and pop store down the street. So yeah, and there's also disadvantages. by law, they would have to be FDIC insured. You can't get around that by having lower limits or whatever. And that is expensive and cumbersome. And if it's not a major advantage, we probably wouldn't want to do that. But here's the final word on it. It's not up to me. It's not up to you. It's not up to the core group of us that are working on this in public banking, Oregon Public Banking Alliance. Somebody asked that question. It's not up to us. The task force will make recommendations based on a thorough analysis of this. And if input from Antonio and anybody else that wants to give their arguments, they'll have to think through those and respond to them just like any other public process like this. That's their job. The task force will look at all the input, use their own expertise and financial analyses that none of us here probably are capable of, and make those decisions. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up. There are definite advantages if we can swing it. Robert?
Yeah, just more of a comment. It seems to me this could be an excellent tool for dealing with the housing affordability crisis we have here in Oregon. It could provide options for lower cost financing to developers of housing or to municipalities who have to put in infrastructure to support that housing. Seems like it could be very useful in that sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you said it very well. I think those are probably the two main reasons. There may be others that it would be advantageous to be able to finance them through this way. Thanks for that, those comments, Robert. Dennis?
Yeah, follow up to the other, you said about public federal agencies being able to work with the potential state bank, let's call it. Would there be anything preventing, some of these agencies have zero interest loans that they use specifically in rural areas and underserved communities. Would the potential state bank be able to use maybe a pass-through program for these zero interest loans through the conventional conventional banks and credit unions?
That's my understanding, and that's what I was alluding to when I said these special programs that would include the zero interest loans, where it's efficient and where it would be helpful. Some loans are directly from the federal government that don't go through any bank, or credits and things like that don't necessarily have to go through a bank. Rebates, credits, a lot of those programs are like that. But a zero interest loan, I can't think of an example, but if they exist, I don't see any reason that they couldn't be passed through a state bank too. I mean, that's the function. If it's a block grant or any special funding that goes directly to the state, that's where it's going to go in the state bank, because that's where all of our funds go. Besides again, I don't want to get into the details because a lot of that has to be worked out by the task force. But yes, in general, I think you're right. Dave?
Yeah. Hi, Rick. So how would a state bank impact something like the work? I think you're familiar with the work that Chuck Willer and the Coast Range Association is proposing, where they will do land reform with private industrial forests and this kind of just transition concept of transferring lands to locally owned and operated social benefit enterprises. Are you familiar enough with that, Rick, to kind of comment on how state bank might impact a project like that?
No, all I know about is what you just told me. I'm planning on attending Chuck's next lecture, but I missed the last one, and I understand he's even improved it more. So hopefully I'll get more out of the next opportunity. Do you want to make some comments on that though?
Well, I mean, just generally speaking, when we talk about just transition and, getting these Wall Street owned forests into the hands of local communities, I could imagine how it might fit, but I didn't know if you had any free, you know, or just transition in general.
Yeah, Chuck would know much better than me how those things are financed, who the money goes to, where it comes from, what the options are. If I knew all that, I could make some intelligent comments, but I'd only be guessing about how all that works.
I'm just trying to keep you, just keep your on your toes. That's all.
Well, it sounds good. I mean, if Chuck thought of it, I'll bet it's a pretty darn good idea. He's a pretty deep thinker.
Thanks, Rick.
You bet. Thank you. I'm surprised nobody's asked me about how do we keep politicians from getting their dirty fingers all over. That's a common question. People assume that that if the bank is owned by the state, and the state charters it, that even if there's a governing board that's nominally independent, how is it really independent? Is it really independent? There's different ways you can set that up, and some of them are safer than others. Keep them safer from politicians than others. Actually, Bank of North Dakota was a little too trusting when they set theirs up and had a little financial crisis and found out that wasn't the way to do it. So we do have some experience, and people have thought through this deeply. My understanding is that the idea, again, the details are up to the legislature once the task force completes its mission, but the idea, if I understand it, is that the governor would appoint people to the board, but they'd have to be approved by the legislature, and these would be banking professionals. The Bank of North Dakota, for instance, has at least 2 banking professionals who work in local banking or credit unions, and at least one with experience working on Wall Street. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, we have somebody experienced working on Wall Street working with us, as well as somebody who started a local bank. So we're pretty well represented, and we get a lot of points of view, but we're not going to make the decisions. The task force will. We will, however, have some input into who's on the task force. But as far as the governing board, that's different. It'll be banking professionals. And yes, politicians will decide who's on it, but in a way where there'll be checks and balances. That's the only detail I want to get into, because the exact checks and balances are up to the task force to recommend to the legislature, and the legislature to write into legislation. Any other questions? Well, okay. There will be a quiz later, since I know a lot of you. Yeah, if you think of questions later, I really would recommend everybody whose interest has been stimulated to go to the websites that were just put in the chat a little bit ago by Linda. That's public Oregon Bank, OregonPublicBanking.com, and the publicbankinginstitute.org, which is the national organization that we work with.
Yeah, those were put into the chat by Mike Beilstein, so thank you,
by
Mike.
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah.
Mike.
I want to say that this meeting has been recorded, so I believe that it will be available for viewing later on the Corvallis League of Women Voters website. If Annette, if you're still here, could you confirm that, please? I don't know if she's still here.
Oh,
She
yes,
is.
I'm here. I've been listening. Yes, as far as I know, I have been recording it and I just need to get it to the right people who can put it up on our YouTube. So
Thank you.
I'll let you know, Linda, as soon as it's available.
So if it's on YouTube, that means it's shareable. Somebody that had to leave early asked me what they could do to help promote this. And I'll tell you right now, what the Oregon Public Banking Alliance needs most. We have people who are professional campaign people and legislative aides. And so we know about the inside baseball stuff, and sure, contact your legislators and let them know you like this. But what we really need help with is building more people to be aware of this, to support it, to help spread the word. And if you're really interested, help us with our work. If you want to help us with our work, I'm going to put my contact information in the chat, so people can contact me directly if they want, and I could tell you what kind of opportunities they are. You wouldn't necessarily have to attend meetings. There's lots of ways that you can help us with this networking and organization building.
Well, Rick, I have a comment or a question. I'm using a new computer and I can't find the raise hand function on this, so
Oh, sure.
sorry. But it's my understanding that in North Dakota, all state revenues, like, the income tax and any, I suppose they have sales tax and stuff, all revenues go into the Bank of North Dakota. And so, so that's another, it's not just the excess money that the state would normally be putting into the, in the savings accounts or whatever with Wall Street banks, but it's actually all their revenues go to the bank. So the bank, is capitalized at a very high level, because if you consider, what, state revenue in Oregon is, if that was, and then you capitalize that, and and of course, the state has has operating expenses, so those have to come out of that bank. But it's not just the excess money that would go into it, but well, at least in the North Dakota model, it's all state revenues go into the state bank.
Yeah, again, that's a legal question. I don't know that for a fact, and I don't know if you can do it in Oregon, so I wouldn't say for sure. There are legal restrictions about how some money can be used, and being put in a public bank may not be acceptable, may not be a legal use. So it depends on the state and the state laws, at least, if not for technical reasons. So I can't say for sure that would be correct. But if that may be how it works in North Dakota, which would show it's theoretically possible. Again, that's a question for the state base. It may not be practical to put some funds in. That can't be touched. Maybe they're by law, you can't risk them by using them for loans. You can put the main reason that I even bothered to make the distinction, because it gets complicated, is when you talk about capitalizing the bank, it's where's the money going to come from? People always ask. And there, you can't just take any money out of the state and put it in there. Only certain funds are allowable, which is why we might have to go to private investors or institutional investors like union pension funds. So that the biggest question is capitalizing it. Once you get it, what you can put in it, I don't know for sure, but there will be sufficient capital for it to be very worthwhile. And as it grows, we'll be able to do all of these things that we've talked about and more.
Thanks.
Sure. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, a lot of this stuff does get pretty wonky, and I hope I'm not putting anybody to sleep with the details. It's the big picture I'm trying to paint. But as I was saying, anybody that wants to help can. I just put my contact information in the chat. So if you want to get involved in any way, brainstorming ideas for contacts, telling me groups that might be interested, maybe you'll volunteer to write some blasts for our emails, or at least sketch out outlines for them, and somebody else can finish it if you don't feel you can do a polished product. Lots of ways. So we need all hands on deck, because when it becomes obvious that this thing's catching on, we're going to face incredible opposition from the banking industry. So far, they haven't put a lot of firepower into it. The The only comments they made again on the when the governor asked for comments on the task force, the only comment that was made by the banking industry, the one negative statement that that made it to the comments was from a banking lobbyist who represents not just Oregon banks, but also the big banks that operate in Oregon. And guess who actually funds them, and guess who calls the shots? The people that we're trying to escape from. So we got to keep that in mind. We're going to face very, very deep pockets, very, very invested in the current system. We don't want any challenge to their control over how our public dollars are spent, including at the state level. Any last questions? Well, thank you all for coming. Again, I really appreciate your patience for sticking around with our technical difficulties, and I will see some of you in the near future and hopefully hear from others of you who I haven't met before.
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Good meeting. Bye.